Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. This is the sixth event in a series of events that have been taking place this fall called Setting Global Cultural Limits 30 Years After Berlin, 1989. And we've had previously a panel discussion. We've had a couple of film screenings, and I'm very happy now that we are going to be talking together today about climate change, which is the general direction which our program has taken us. And we have a guest speaker from Germany who gave a talk last night and is here today to participate in this roundtable discussion with us, Susanne Götze, who is an environmental journalist from Berlin. Bob Walker is a professor of geography, and Jasmine McNeely is a journalist. And Ken Sassaman is in the Department of Anthropology. Talk about a little bit about our team in a minute. I've worked many times in the past with Terry Harpold, who is a professor of English and the director of Imagining Climate Change, and Marcel Lewandowski, who is the new Dodd professor here at the University of Florida, and he is in the Center for European Studies. I think it's a rare occasion when we have people from different disciplines, such as this. This is therefore going to be both an international and an interdisciplinary discussion on climate change, and it needs to be that because the whole proposition is that what needs to be constructed is an effective, efficacious global climate change discourse, which doesn't really seem yet, at least, to be in place. And certainly, hopefully, discussions such as this will be one way in which we can begin to generate momentum in the direction of producing such an efficacious discourse. I should mention there are numerous instances that have made this all of these events possible, including the events today. The Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany has generously supported this event and past similar events. The Imagineering and Technosphere Mellon Intersections Group is also a supporter of these events. With respect to the Mellon Intersections Group on Imagineering and the Technosphere, UF Intersections is a new program that brings faculty together across disciplines to address grand challenge questions in our world. Our group's question is, how do technologies influence our lives then and now? Students can pursue this question through multiple courses and earn the distinction of becoming an intersection scholar equipped to tackle this issue in their work. For more information, visit Intersections Humanities UFL EDU. Intersections is organized by the UF Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. And there are a few more sources of support that I would like to mention. UF's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the University of Florida International Center, the Center for European Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, and last but not least, I should mention the Imagining Climate Change Initiative. So having mentioned all of the people and thanked all of the people who have made this possible. I'd like to go ahead and move forward to our panel discussion. What I'd like to do is ask our guest speaker, Susanne Götze, to make a brief presentation of a few minutes. And then after that, I've asked each of the other speakers on the panel to just say a few words with respect to the interest they have in the issue of climate change, and in particular in the question of an efficacious global discourse on climate change. What's standing in the way of this, and what might be some solutions to remove some of the obstacles to making progress. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Susanne Götze.
Thank you again for, thank you again for having me again and give me the chance again to talk to this particular audience. I already talked yesterday a little bit about this subject, but today I wanted to present briefly the results of the 2-year investigation we made together with my colleague Annika Jöres in Europe. She's living in France and I'm living in Berlin, and together for 2 years we did an investigation that I want to present. We're having a lot of scientists sitting here on the panel, and I'm glad to give an input, but of course our work is an investigation, not a study. So,
Pardon. I'm going to just switch this.
Hello? Yeah, jetzt now. Hello? Hello? It don't work. No.
Switched on the line?
Huh?
Does it have a switch on the side?
No. I don't know. My voice is not strong.
Okay.
So, but it worked and now it don't work. Strange, no? One moment it worked. This worked.
Okay. We'll go back to this one. Tell me to switch this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I need the mic. What the so, yeah, still nothing. Hello.
We may just have to project.
Okay.
Hello?
Now the others work. I just take it in my hands, you know. We won't. Yeah, I just take it in my hands, so everything. No, don't like me, I think. So this is a climate denial lobby who tried to stop my speech. I'm joking. So I wanted to give an input for like 15 minutes for this panel, and I'm really curious also about the perspective and the opinions of the scientists sitting here. And yeah, I want to make it strong that I'm a journalist, so I'm not a scientist, and we didn't do like a study like scientists do study, or like you are like the scientists in future do studies. So we did a journalistic investigation, and I'm a freelancer, and my colleague is also a freelancer. And we, for this investigation, worked together also with different scientists from universities, University of Hamburg, but also Adelphi. It's like a think tank, political scientific think tank, also sitting in Berlin. One part of this investigation was to find out where do these climate deniers came from, with whom they are connected, and who are they, and to understand, okay, what they are doing right now, because this is like a phenomenon, like when we started the investigation like 3 years ago, and then 2 years ago we really started, but the first idea came up 3 years ago. Everybody told us, oh no, this is over, climate denial, this is something from yesterday, it's no longer interesting. And then we had everything what happened in the last 3 years, including what's happened here in the US. And so, yeah, it is more in the news and more actual than ever before. And what we had in the beginning for our investigation, we had a database of thousands of names of people who are denying publicly, or in public, the climate change, and who worked with scientists. And we also did a kind of network analysis with this kind of data, but we also went to conferences. So we meet people, we interviewed people from this kind of climate denier scene, and we try to understand what happens. So we are not only sitting on our desk, we're going out and try to find out directly with the people. So I just give you some results that you have an idea, because of course a 2-year investigation I cannot put in 15 minutes, but I give you the most important highlights. So first of it, we found out that climate deniers are often connected with right-wing circles or parties and think tanks in many countries. It is not like a phenomenon from only in the US, but it's happened in many countries, and it's always like the same scheme or the same framework. Secondly, the real climate deniers are a kind of concept pool for the right-wing neoconservative and neoliberal groups or interest groups. Third, there is like an intersection or connection between the climate denier scenes and the conspiracy theories of the right-wing scene. And I give you one example. You see here on the slide. This was a slide in New Orleans, advertisement. It is a think tank called CFACT, which advertise this kind of message. And the message is, Russia founded green groups millions of dollars to oppose fracking and cripple American energy. How's that for collusion? So this, I mean, with conspiracy theories. So this, for example, theory was then in a conference where I was in New Orleans. They talked like 2 hours about these kinds of theory. So, and said, okay, Russia paid Greenpeace so that Greenpeace destroys the US. So this is like the typical conspiracy narrative from this kind of right-wing groups. The fourth point I made here in the first slide is like fossil fuel lobbies the fossil fuel lobby is often linked to right-wing or conservative think tanks or parties, and so are the climate deniers. So we have the three of them. We have the think tanks, the fossil fuel lobbies, and the hardcore climate deniers. And the fifth is same with what I was writing here, with same ideologies. So they share the same ideologies, means they have a 20th century fossil fuel ideology, how we call it. And they want, in the same time, they want to save this 20th century fossil fuel world, but in the same times also support like patriotism, nationalism, anti-multilateralism, and they are against any environmental regulation, so they have a strictly neoliberal agenda. So in general, we can say they are, these kind of people are also not only against environmental regulation, but also they want that the state pay for the damage, but shouldn't interfere in the market. And this is, I think, a very important point, because this is like important to understand that it's not only the right wing, but also like strictly neoliberal think tanks who lobby against climate policies. And here we have a kind of overlapping ideologies. So I want to give you just some examples of these results I give you, that you can perhaps better imagine what happened. I went to New Orleans like 1 year ago, and in New Orleans there was the annual climate change conference from the Heartland Institute, one of the most important right-wing neoliberal think tanks in the US. And I interviewed a lot of the Heartland staff. This is like the Tim Hulskamp. This was the director 1 year ago. Now they have another. And the amazing thing was that they pretend to be one of who pushed up Trump to leave the Paris Agreement, and they're very proud about that. And they're kind of connected also with the Trump administration. So you have also in other think tanks, you have this overlapping stuff between, also you have people who worked in the think tanks and then work for the Trump administration, or the other way around. This conference, just to imagine, is not only about climate change. It's a whole ideology behind it. It's a mix of this kind of patriotic nationalist fossil fuel identity stuff. And it's backed by a kind of fake science. When you see here, these are publications which are financed from the Heartland Institute. And this is not small little magazines. These are like big books, thousands of pages. And this is like they are scientists or climate deniers publishing their articles in this kind of publication from the Heartland Institute. And what is interesting, how they are called. So the World Climate Change Council, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is like which does normally the global climate change reports for the United Nations, is called the IPCC, and they call themselves the NIPCC, so the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. So they take the same name and they pretend they are non-governmental, so they are more independent. So this is, for example, one example of a narrative. They say we are so independent, and so we do the real science because we are not depending on any government, and the IPCC is. So they try to delegitimate the official science. But then going away from the US, we are looking for connections to Europe, because we are more interested in Europe, because here in the US you have very good studies about your climate denial scene. So this, what I tell you, is nothing new for the specialists here. So we are looking, okay, did this happen also in Europe? And what we found, yes, it happened in Europe, and there are a lot of connections. I give you just some examples. We went some months later to a Porto climate conference, so-called Porto climate conference, and this was like a meeting from European climate deniers. And the first speaker, or the second, or the keynote speaker from this conference was Christopher Essex. He is a Heartland Institute fellow from the US, and it's very interesting that he was like the first speaking in this conference. So here you see a little bit the audience of the European climate deniers, as you have an image, and or you have an idea what they are looking like. And what is very interesting, I don't know if you see this, I don't want to go too far or to discriminate anybody, but the audience of these conferences, or also the actors or the main actors of this scene, a white old man, and 95% I would say, and very, very few women, and nearly no youngsters. So yeah, welcome to this world. So next we went to EIKE conference. EIKE is like the most important German climate denier think tank. Or think tank is an association. We don't know how big they are because they don't have to publish anything about themselves, so they keep it a little bit secret, so we don't know how big they are. Perhaps it's only an association, but they are doing quite a lot of stuff, and for example these annually conferences, and they are always supported by the Heartland Institute. It's so-called a co-sponsoring. We don't know how much money flew, so this is just we don't know. And we have also here the same. We have a Heartland Institute speaker. He do like after it's like the second speaker in this conference. And we have, for example, also Myron Abel. Hello? No. I try this now. Ah. Yeah. We have, hello? Yeah. I think there's something with the Wi-Fi or something. Yeah? No. Das geht gar nicht. It's not working. I try like this. Yeah. So Myron Abel is, yeah, it's one of you know him certainly, is one of the very close co-workers, or like he's in close collaboration with Trump, and yeah, he's also invited to this kind of conferences. This was this example. So yeah, and this year, this I just wanted to tell you again as a third example. This year, Heartland have its conference in the Trump International Hotel in Washington. This is no surprise for you, I imagine. But what is surprising for us was the two keynote speakers were Europeans this year. So they are like they have stronger and stronger relations with the Europeans, and this is what is interesting to understand the global rollback scene, or the global climate denier scene who try to stop climate legislation. We have Dominik Koloros, like Polish trade union activist from Solidarność, who spoke. He spoke only via Skype, but he spoke. And then in person we had Mr. Müller, and he is like the president of EIKE, of the German climate denier think tanks, and he was there in Washington to speak. So these are interesting connections. And I talk also with this guy. You know him as like probably the most famous climate denier in the whole world. As he sees himself, I don't know if he really is, Mark Moreno, and he is like working for CFACT. And this I tell you because I just briefly want to give you some idea about the connections, you know, because we have like not a lot financial, as proofs of financial interactions, but we have some, and we can imagine how it works. And so you see also the like connections between Europe or Germany and the US and how they are connected. And so we start above. For example, we have the Koch brothers. Perhaps you know them. It's like a big industrial conglomeration of different companies producing or extracting fossil fuels, producing plastic, doing all this kind of stuff, which is not very nice for the environment. And they are really, really conservative, right-wing, neoliberal, and don't want to change. They finance a couple of foundations and think tanks. Among them, also Donors Trust. Donors Trust is a really, really big foundation which finance like right-wing groups. So, and they give the money to CFACT. CFACT is like is like not a big think tank, but is a think tank which do only climate denying. So they're producing a lot of material, giving conferences, going to schools. They do this kind of stuff. So, and they have a branch in Germany called CFACT Germany or CFACT Europe, one of these, and they have the main seat like EIKE in Jena. And EIKE, you remember the German think tank. So, and you have the same persons, like both directors are the same person, like from CFACT Germany and from EIKE. So you can imagine the money flow. And what is now interesting also perhaps for the discussion is EIKE is this kind of concept pool for the German AfD, which is a German right-wing party, relatively new. And we have some expert here who can tell you a little bit more about the AfD. And so, yeah, we say, or we find out that EIKE was the reason why the AfD turned into climate denying. So this is an example to see that these think tanks are not only there to produce their material and like, no, they have a strategy, and they want to work closely with politicians. And they try to find everywhere to influence them and to get them on their side. And in the case of EIKE, it worked. Or in the same of, for example, in the case of Heartland, worked also. So withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is nothing small. And EIKE is the same. And now now the AfD, this right-wing populist party, is the biggest opposition party in the Bundestag, in the German parliament. and they are climate deniers. They do speeches, they invite climate deniers in the parliament, so a big disaster, you know. And so money from taxpayers goes into pay these kind of climate deniers, to invite them for the infrastructure, etc. So we have a concrete impact of these work from these think tanks. And yeah, here again, you see again this, like, you have perhaps money or ideas. Not only the money is interesting, but also the narratives that come, for example, from the US, go into EIKE, go into the Alternative for Deutschland and the right-wing party. This right-wing party is in the Bundestag, but is also connected with other right-wing groups in Germany, but also in Europe. You know, they have influence. Also, the right-wing parties in Europe meet each other and interact, and so you have even more interactions. So, and the last slide before we come to our discussions is I want to make just a point about why is it that right-wing or neoliberal think tanks, politicians are also climate deniers. Why this? Some discussions in Germany, we say, okay, it's strange because conservatives are often very religious. And for example, the Pope published the encyclica, which is like the book about climate change for religious people. And so why the conservative, I think there are a lot of conservatives also are supporting climate change policies, so regulation, etc. for change, but not all. And in the same time, they are like in the same boat, not always, but often the same boat with nationalists, sometimes allied with right-wing thinking or xenophobia. And then you have also the market radicals and the neoliberalists. And I want to show here with this slide only like why it is like this kind of thinking is like in opposition to what an ambitious climate policy should be. Or this kind, for example, for an ambitious climate policy, we need a market regulation, we need taxes, we need environmental regulations, we need international corporations and development aid, we need ecological transformation, and we have this kind of discussion about degrowth and sufficiency, etc. This is all the climate discussion. And when you see this and what I talk to you about, what is about neoliberalism and radicalism, nationalism, etc., you see why it cannot work together. And this is like to give you an idea why these two things cannot go together and why they work so hard, the right-wing part works so hard to stop climate legislation. It's not only because they don't believe in climate change or something, there's a deeper ideological meaning and reasons. Yeah, this is only to give you an idea about our research. We make a lot of slides like this, who is connected with whom, and I don't go into details, it's just to show you. We worked also like with a network analysis like this, and just the last word, little conclusion of our book we will publish. I'm sorry, it's in German. I hope it will be translated in English. But first it will be published in Germany in April. We are just finishing this book last week. And one of the things we realized is that the right-wing climate denier internationalism works through a bunch of think tanks which are connected through publication, conferences, consultants, and has an open or covert influence on national politics or parties. This is what I wanted to tell you, to prove you today. And also we realized that this kind of connections are not very much in public, you know. This is also very important. During this investigation, we saw how intransparent is especially the European system, and for example, when it comes to finance, and they are not discussed, this connection, and we think that the climate movement, or also politicians or journalists who are engaged in climate politics are often not aware what these right-wing what these climate that these right-wing players prepare this kind of rollback, you know, is not coincidence that don't happen so much in climate politics. We say it's no coincidence. It's they preparing a kind of rollback, and that is the rollback and this rollback is like supported with a lot of money. And this is important to understand when you want to go and to change climate politics, to understand what you are confronting with. Thank you. I hope, yeah, it works.
Yep. Okay. From here? Okay. I am going to touch on the issue of the efficacious discourse, but before I do that, I'd like to make some more pointed remarks about my research area, which is focused on Amazonian deforestation. And there are some important tie-ins here. For one thing, many people think that global climate change will ultimately erase the forest from the surface of the earth through heat stress in a process called forest dieback. Another tie-in is that through what's called the tipping point, the level of deforestation could reach a level whereby rainfall recycling would be compromised, and this would desiccate the Amazon basin, lead to significant climate impacts, drought intensification in both South America and North America. So there are tie-ins, and I'll proceed with some remarks on Amazonia with respect to the genuine, the imaginary, and the fake. I think it is the good, the bad, and the ugly, I guess. And I'll take a slightly different take on the imaginary, I think, than maybe has been taken within this group. So with respect to the genuine, I think this is pretty straightforward and easy. I'm on the science side of the humanities, science, whatever, spectrum or divide. So for me, it's easy. The genuine would be what the scientists do. And so, for example, the genuine physics and the genuine atmospheric sciences used by the climate modelers to understand the links between carbon dioxide emissions and, say, sea surface temperatures, that would be an example of a genuine, well-intentioned activity. I could go on all afternoon with these sorts of activities, but I won't. I would like to point out that it's not always genuine, that scientists do falsify their data at times. There was a book written when I was a graduate student called How to Lie with Statistics. Now, I don't do that, but some people do. In general, though, I would say the scientific endeavor, whether in the Amazon or anywhere else, climate change science more generally speaking, is a genuine endeavor, and that the intentions are mostly genuine. So as for the imaginary, I think this is where I have a slightly different take. I'd like to start out with a distinction between the imaginary and the fake. And in some respects, they're a bit similar in that both, from my perspective, are founded on a departure from reality. Now, they're different departures, and the distinction has to be made sharply. I would say that the imaginary, in most respects, is a benign misapprehension, as opposed to the fake, which would be a malignant, deliberate distortion of the facts. And these would be the sorts of distortions that a climate falsifier would probably make. Now, as for the imaginary with respect to the Amazon, but also to the global environment more generally, well, you can identify a number of imaginaries, but two come to mind rather quickly, and both of them are based on exaggerations, I would say. And the first is an exaggeration of the value of nature. And that may sound a bit extreme, but you've probably heard the phrasing, the forests of the Amazon are the lungs of the earth. That's a really striking and powerful metaphor, but strictly speaking, it's not really correct in the sense that the forest will take what it receives. It produces the oxygen, but it reabsorbs it because forests not only photosynthesize, they respire. Okay, so that would be one exaggeration. The second exaggeration, or the second imaginary based on an exaggeration, would be an exaggeration that perceives the immediacy of nature's demise, for lack of a better expression. Now, So I guess it was 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, there was a lot of publicity about the fires in Amazonia and a lot of concern. Now, the concern was legitimate. I did a Reddit Ask Me Anything session for the University of Florida and responded to maybe several hundred questions, and I was struck by the degree of apocalyptic concern that many people had about the fires. And the concerns were extreme. Now, I'm not trying to underplay the importance of the fires, but the Amazon was by no means on the threshold of an apocalyptic disappearance at that point. So moving on to the fake, this is where it gets, I think, a bit interesting. And the fake, it's a scary word for me now. It's with fake news and alternative sets of facts, alternative realities. It's really become, for me at least, a four-letter word. And there's some really important fakes with respect to Amazonia, but also climate, or the climate discourse more generally. And the first fake I'd like to mention is a fairly subtle kind of fake that you get in the environmental impact assessments that are done for large infrastructure projects in the Amazon. And these routinely underestimate the forest impacts, the climate impacts of the building of dams, the building of roads, and what have you. And whether it's deliberate or not, the outcome is always the same. It, in a sense, pacifies the public, and the public are made to believe that there's nothing to worry about. But of course, there is something to worry about. I don't want to fault the engineers who do these studies necessarily. They're essentially given a handbook and a set of rules to follow in their analyses, in which case the fake becomes really insidious because it's hidden away, buried in the methodology that's used to create the facts. Now, the second kind of fake is really an egregious one. I think this gets a little more directly to your wonderful presentation and climate denial and kind of the egregious nature of the faking that goes on. And the one I'm going to bring to light, and some of you may have heard this in the news, but when the fires broke out in Amazonia, the Brazilian president, President Bolsonaro, he made some really outrageous claims. And the one that stuck out that really struck me was his claim that the fires were set by environmentalists who had snuck into the forest at night and lit the forest on fire just to embarrass him in the public meetings. Now, this is a fake that really borders on a paranoid delusion, and it's pretty worrisome when it's something that's uttered by a head of state, obviously in close alliance with the types of groups you've mentioned. So, summing it all up and getting back to, I think, what I'm supposed to say here about efficacious climate change discourse, for me, the big problem is with the fakes. And, those people with imaginaries, in my experience, they're really hungry for the genuine. And you can sit down and have a conversation with the people with the imaginaries and, present them with the facts that they will take to be as genuine. I don't see a problem there. But, the thing with the fakes is that I take a conflictive view of this. And I see it as more of a structural problem and not something discursive. In other words, I don't think you simply unblock the discourse here. And what it really boils down to me is something quite simple, which is how do you convince someone of something that they've deliberately rejected for reasons of self-interest? And as an academic, I hate to say this is my concluding statement, I don't know.
So thank you both for kind of setting it up. So I guess if I were to sum up kind of what I'm going to say is that language matters, right? So my name is Jasmine McNeely. I am associate professor in the College of Journalism and Communications. My research focuses on emergent technology, emergent media, and how it's used both as a surveillance tool, but also as a tool for communicating various kinds of stuff. And also about the effects or the implications of those technologies, particularly on marginalized groups. When we think about technology and social media and digital media And all of these emergent technologies, I'm thinking of algorithmic decision-making systems. So like, do any of you listen to Spotify? Right? So any of you on Netflix? Right? So you're giving Amazon, right? So you're giving recommendations, right? And these systems give you these recommendations based off of data that they give you. It's based off of data. Think of data as a device of communication. But thinking about social media, thinking about the affordances of social media is that we can communicate instantly with a whole lot of people. So let me ask you this, and this is the audience participation segment of the evening. Who are the influencers that you follow? Just yell them out. Your brother? Okay. How many followers does your brother have? 1,000? Okay. Wow. Who else do you always go to? If you're on Instagram, if you're on Twitter, Leonardo DiCaprio? Who else?
Got a lot.
Who are the famous people you follow?
Beyonce?
Beyonce, right. So,
Nice.
okay, so we have this guy's brother, we have Leonardo DiCaprio, and we have Beyonce, right? So what if I told you that to make someone influencers have a lot of followers, right? So people will listen to what they say. So what if I told you that for people who are denying climate change, people who use other kinds of misinformation to try to reach the public, what they try to do is hit up those people who have a lot of followers. Why? Because then they can communicate their message to a wide swath of people. Even if we have the majority of people who reject those messages, there's a certain percentage of people who will accept them. And that's what they need. Because then if you get one person, it's a possibility that person can influence another person, and it spreads. It's like, pick your gross disease, right? If you get one person that has it, it's flu season, somebody sneezes, it spreads. You said so? Oh, it's over. Okay. It's over. Exactly. So that's the affordance of social media. That's the affordance of digital media. And that's one of the problems that we have, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, is that people will put up stuff that is deliberately false. And they'll do it in a way that attracts other people. And that's called framing. We call it framing. So we make certain parts of the information, the message we want to get out to people, more salient, more relevant to you. If I can get Beyonce to say, go vegan.
Sorry, Beyonce.
Some people will go vegan because Beyonce said you should go vegan. If I get Kim or one of the other Kardashian Jenner sisters to say that my new makeup product is really good, they can influence some people to adopt my new makeup product. So what does this mean for climate change? It means that if I'm a climate change denier and am I making a concerted effort to get people to believe what I have to say, to influence the public who then influence the politicians, then what I need is to use these technologies to attempt to influence people. Also, social media is a tool for amplification. If I want my message to get out to a lot of people, I use social media. I use a newspaper or a traditional media outlet that reaches a lot of people. So, for example, in the United States, if I'm thinking of not a social media outlet, but if I'm thinking of a regular or traditional media outlet that's big, that reaches a lot of people, who do I go after? Instagram. Okay, but outside of social media. New York Times, the LA Times, CNN, right? Fox News, right? These are huge platforms. I want them because they amplify my message. I could be the worst person, but if my message gets out, I could do something stupid. But if I'm viewed on CNN, then I can get people's attentions. That's the power of media. That's the power of framing and language. But also the last part of it is the connection with technology. like many people within this climate change discussion say that technology will save us. I'm not convinced. I will say, though, because language matters, how we analogize technology as a savior has implications for our continued use of that technology, but also how we ignore the problems in technology. If I'm thinking of particularly algorithmic systems, so we have our recommendation systems that gives us like all kinds of good content, right? We also have these decision systems that are used in various capacities. But what if I told you those systems also make a lot of pollution? They do. If you go into the MIT Tech Review a couple of weeks ago, they talked about the sheer amount of environmental damage that algorithmic systems create. They create environmental damage. They use a lot of energy, right? Not necessarily renewable energy as well. Similar thing, for any of you have any Bitcoin, right? Any other cryptocurrency? Well, you have to mine for it, right? That uses I mean, they're high school, they could have money, right? but they sell it. But you have to mine for it. That uses a significant amount of energy, right? So technology may play a role in helping us, but if we don't pay attention to what's happening behind, like the new fancy shiny thing, it also hurts us with respect to environment and climate change. Thank you.
I'm going to go out. I literally think better on my feet, so I'm coming up here. And I'm pretty loud. Is that okay? Do I need this? All right.
You do. They're recording.
Oh, I'm sorry. You do. Okay, now I'm even louder. Thank you. I understand most of you are IB German students. Is that true? Yeah. Can I get away by saying V Gates? Is that all right? Is that too informal? No, okay. 5 years of Hochdeutsch didn't serve me well. I went to Baden-Württemberg, and the Schwäbisch was unintelligible to me. So I implore you to use what you've learned, keep using it, keep it going, because otherwise you'll be like me, and it'll be completely incomprehensible to you someday. I'm an archaeologist, and I study the ancient past of Florida. About 10 years ago, I started working on the coast. Working in Florida, it's hard to ignore climate change issues, particularly on the coast with hurricanes, sea level rise, coastal erosion. My first introduction on the coast was a cemetery washing out at 4,500 years ago, 32 individuals, buried almost 5,000 years ago, now washing out on the beach face. They were buried at a time when sea level was down considerably. You guys know when humans first arrived in Florida? About 13,000 years ago was the end of the Ice Age. When they arrived in Florida at the end of the Ice Age, you guys know Tampa? Tampa was central Florida. The coast was 250 kilometers to the west. Sea level was down 80 meters. So we've had tremendous amount of sea level rise over the time of human occupation in Florida alone. And so I thought as an archaeologist, what I could contribute to the dialogue of climate change is the long view. Like how have people adapted to sea level rise and climate change over millennia? We have an incredible archaeological potential for addressing that. Unfortunately, after doing it for about 8-9 years, I came to realize that it's not resonating with modern society very well for a number of reasons. So for one is that there's a different kind of denier than what we've been talking about. There's people that will accept that climate change is happening, but they'll point to the fact that it's always happened. And they're not wrong. What they're not pointing out is that it's accelerated with the industrialization that's given us the hockey stick. That hockey stick actually occurred about 13,000 years ago too, not because of combustible fossil fuels, but because of tremendous change in global temperatures, the collapse of ice sheets, and tremendous rise in sea level. But what happens is when you inform people about the long-term effects of sea level change and climate change, and they say that it's always happened, it somehow diffuses and kind of decenters their responsibility for the more recent changes. You ever heard the term the Anthropocene? Most scientists might say the Anthropocene started with industrialization, but there are some people that want to push it back to 20,000 years ago, at least 15,000 years ago, in the early days of agriculture when they started plowing up the fields of Mesopotamia. right? So there's like this, I didn't expect this. I didn't see it coming. That by contributing to long view, I was actually diffusing people's responsibilities for the most recent past. So as I'm like fretting over this and wondering if I have any role to play in changing people's opinion about climate change, I was reading a study by Stanford University a few years ago where they went to Texas and Oklahoma, sociologists, collecting scientific data on people's perception of climate change. And what they found out was that these are red states, right? Mostly Republican. They found out that farmers who otherwise would support Republican agendas, who had up to that point denied climate change, were accepting the fact that it was real, not because of the science, not because of CNN, not because of the New York Times, not because of social media, because their cows were dying and their soil was drying up. They felt it. They could feel it in their bones. They could feel it in their heart. They were losing their livelihood and they were losing their land, and so they believe it and they do something about it, right? So I realized at that point that my study of the ancient past has a problem, which is that it's too dehumanizing. We can't have empathy for people living thousands of years ago. We don't know who they are. I can't give you names. I can't talk about how they felt about their world. I can tell you what they ate and where they lived. That doesn't really tell you much about how they perceive their environment. So I changed last year to something I'd never done in 36 years of archaeology. I started working with the contemporary past. You guys, Cedar Key? Cedar Key, great place, north of Tampa, Gulf Coast. It's an old fishing village. It's part of the larger National Wildlife Refuge, so largely undeveloped, not much commercialization. To be cliche about it, it's a town frozen in time. But off the shore of Cedar Key, and there's about 800 permanent residents there, off the shore of Cedar Key is an island called Ascendioti. Ascendioti was the original town of Cedar Key. It's now abandoned. In 1896, a hurricane pretty much wiped out the infrastructure there. It took out the cedar mill industry, which was the mainstay of their economy, wiped out most of the houses. There were about 50 households there. And a few decades later, it was completely abandoned, and today it is now part of the National Wildlife Refuge. It's an archaeological site. So we're doing the archaeology of Ascendioti, and ultimately using new technologies, we're going to bring it back to life with virtual reality. I want you to be able to walk through the streets of Ascendioti in 1890 and meet people there and talk to them about their lives on the water and the effect that climate change has had and how they dealt with hurricanes and how they survived them. We have firsthand accounts that have been written down of that. We're also going to put you into the larger context of the vulnerabilities that they created. It's not just that the storm was bad. Storms can be bad, but they're only bad when people are vulnerable, when people put themselves in a place where the storm can impact their lives, devastate their futures, right? So what the story really comes down to is that the hurricane itself wasn't terrible. It was the land use practices of overexploiting the cedar that made them sort of vulnerable. Physically, by increasing the erosive capacity of the storm on the shoreline, and then not having an economic foundation to bounce back from, right? Nothing to work with. They had to completely change the way they were doing things. So archaeology, looking at the deep past, I thought maybe there was something that was there. It isn't doing what I thought it would, but I'm hopeful with modern technologies, although I just realized yesterday too that I may be building something that's got a bigger carbon footprint than more conventional technology, so I do worry about that. But I do hope that if I can give you a sensory experience like those farmers in Oklahoma and Texas, if I can make you feel what it's like to see climate change, not just in the short term, but somehow mash it together. I'm going to do a mashup. Is this an imaginary or is this a fake? I don't know. This is something I've fret over. But if I can get you to understand what the long-term effects are of climate change by making it sensory, personal, biographical, emotional, then I think you guys are already, I'm preaching to the converted, right? We got any deniers in here? I didn't think so. B. Gates.
So, so many insights from so many perspectives. I hope I can add something. My name is Marcel Lewandowski. I'm a German exchange visiting professor here at the Center for European Studies. And my focus is basically on populist parties, especially the populist radical right, and not only on the parties, but also on the question, well, first, why they're successful, why people vote for these parties, and second, well, the second question is why people vote for these parties. But I'm also dealing with another part that is called supply side of political system, that is which position do these parties take and why do they do so? Now, the problem I'm facing here is how to connect two areas that seem to be kind of different from each other. One is populism, the other is climate change. Do they have anything to do with each other? It doesn't seem so, but in fact they do, and they do have to do a lot with each other. So climate change and populism. Now, the research of populism that connects to the topic of climate change is in its infancy. So there are papers on that. There is research on that, for example, on voters or on party manifestos, but we don't know much yet. But we can say some things, and some things I can tell you here are, I get from empirical research, and some are assumptions that I would like to discuss with you. Now, the interesting part is that populist radical right parties, it wasn't until the last year or 2 years that they competed on the issue of climate change at all. It didn't play a role for them. If you look at comparative data that explains why these parties get elected, then you find that it's one issue that is, which one? What would you guess? Say again, please? Immigration. It's immigration. These parties get voted for because people believe that they take a harsh position on immigration, and people believe that they share their own right-wing position in politics. Now, how does climate change come into play? Now, there is an interesting paper by Matthew Lockwood, who is an environmental researcher at the University of Sussex. And he has claimed that these parties have shifted towards the issue of climate change, and they embrace it in a way because there are chameleons in a way that can change the topics they focus on, which is true, and climate change is a topic that affects their specific electorate in a specific way. Now, we already heard from Susanne Götze that those who vote for these parties too, they are in a way affected or believed to be affected by climate change in a way that they either don't believe it exists, or they don't want any measures to be taken because they might affect their jobs or their way of life. For example, being ashamed, that is a debate in Germany and Europe, being ashamed of driving an SUV is a topic right now in the public debate in Germany. Because SUVs are, I don't know whether that is the case in America, or North America at least, but SUVs are considered to be bad for the environment, and those who drive SUVs are called out. Wouldn't happen here, right? Now, anyways, and secondly, what Matthew Lockwood claims, and I find that quite interesting, is that it could be that it is the case that a lot of those who vote for the populist radical right, they work in carbon-intensive industries. They are blue-collar workers. And so what populist radical right parties can claim is that climate change measures are bad for your job, and you could lose your job over that. Now, here comes the interesting part. That is not only something that, it's not only a position or a fear or an anxiety that you find in the electorate of populist radical right parties, you also find that in the electorate of social democratic parties, which poses a problem to these parties too. So climate change deniers are those who don't want that any measures are taken that might be dangerous for their jobs or their way of life, you don't only find them in the right-wing populist electorate, you find them across different parties, including Christian Democrats, so conservatives, including liberals, and including social democrats. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about, for example, counter strategies. Calling out those who are maybe afraid of climate change measures is not only directed, in fact, against the electorate of right-wing populist parties, but also against the electorate of mainstream parties. The thing is that we shouldn't only focus, and that is another argument that I find kind of intriguing. We shouldn't only focus on positions toward climate change, because it's not only on whether measures should be taken, whether what measures should be taken, whether they have an effect on your job, whether they have an effect on the industry, and so on. It's also an anti-elitist issue. And that is why it is so important and so rational from the position of right-wing populist parties to compete on that issue. Now, Klingemann and Pippa Norris, Engelhardt and Pippa Norris, I'm sorry, they have claimed that one of the major reasons for the success of right-wing populist parties is the cultural backlash. Now, cultural backlash is not only directed against anxieties towards migrants or anxieties towards minorities, it's also against political elites, intellectual elites, cultural elites. And these are connected with climate change measures. So what right-wing populists do is they frame climate change policies as like a policy or a game played by those intellectuals up there who have no idea how your life is and how your job works and what anxieties you have. And that is why it is connected to populism, because populism consists first of appealing to the normal people, to those who are like us and who don't have their say in politics, and secondly, by the definition of Mudd in 2004, secondly, it is against the corrupt elites. And that doesn't only entail the political elites, but also intellectuals, scientists, academics, those who don't speak the language of the normal people. Now, what's the problem now? And I hope I don't speak for too long. What can my discipline, political science, empirical political science, that deals with representative democracy and populist parties in representative democracies and their effect on that, what can that contribute to our discourse here? Now, what I find interesting is that some of the insights that science on climate change gives us shows that intensive and immediate action is to be taken, right? So I think there's somehow a consensus among science on that. The problem here is that this contradicts, in fact, in some way the way representative democracy works. Because representative democracy is slow. Representative democracy, whether it is a European model of democracy or an American, North American model of democracy, doesn't make a difference because it's slow. And it has to be slow to be democratic in a way, and to be democratic it also includes a lot of different opinions that are organized in interest groups that have their say in a way. Now, to take the action that has to be taken is in fact a contradiction to some core parts of representative democracy. That is a dilemma we're facing. And I think we have to deal with this in a way. But what we're doing right now in the public discourse is, and I think it's totally understandable to do that, but it has an effect. We're calling out those who don't want specific measures. I'm not talking about deniers here. I'm talking about those who don't want specific measures to be taken because they are afraid or because it affects their way of life. The problem here is, from a non-normative view, this is still, no matter whether we deny it or not, as an individual or as those who have another political opinion on that, it is still a totally legit view that can be taken and that can be demanded in a democratic society. But then again, measures have to be taken, and they contradict, in turn, this position. So how do we solve that dilemma?
So you're gonna leave me hanging with that question. That is way above my pay grade. There we are. Yeah, that's the answer. I won't read you what we wrote to each other here because it's not for public, for polite audience. I'm Terry Harpold. I am, as Will said, a professor of English here at UF, and I am the founder and director of something called Imagining Climate Change, which tries to create opportunities just like this to bring together humanists and scientists of all stripes to have a conversation about the world that's coming. It's already upon us, and I think it's worth mentioning, though I know all of my panelists here are aware of this. It is already upon us for tens of millions of our sisters and brothers elsewhere on the planet. People are already seeing their livelihood and their worlds damaged by rising temperatures and rising waters and ocean acidification and storm surges, saltwater infiltration, and mass extinction and depredations of one sort or another of their food supplies. So yeah, it's already here. It just hasn't quite arrived in Gainesville yet. If you wonder why I was scribbling furiously the last 40 minutes or so, it's because I was given the ungenerous job of trying to respond in a way to everybody here and kind of tie some loose ends together before we go on for a kind of conversation. I'm going to try my best at that, although I do have my own take on this, and I would like to begin with that observation. You asked about efficacious discourse, and I think a common thread that runs through this is that is aligned with just a general observation that I would make. Storytelling is the most efficacious technology that humans have. It is, in fact, by all evidence, we learn more and more about our fellow creatures. It is the only distinctive technology that we may have. Birds and higher apes and fish and octopuses and everything else can do lots of things that we thought only humans could do in terms of tool use and social organization and establishing hierarchies and structures in their societies and so on. That would take us hours to talk about, but storytelling is the distinctive technology of humans, and it is the thing that changes everything else. It lies at the engine of everything else, and it's important for us to keep that in mind, and I think it's some of the lessons that we've learned from just these wonderful, Susanne's wonderful presentation and then the responses of these other panelists I'm honored to share the time with, that part of the problem lies with the kinds of stories that we tell, or what are the motives of the people who are telling those stories and how we interpret them and how we act in response to them, because the stories are efficacious in the sense that they produce effects. They produce anxiety, they produce joy, they produce fear, they produce determined action. And speaking, as I see now, to an audience that is full of young people, this room, it's wonderful to see you here, it's important that you listen to the stories that are being told to you, because the world that is changing as a consequence of those stories and how you will respond to them is in some ways more your world than my world. And I think it's very important that you pay attention to that. I want to start with Robert's observation that scientific endeavor is generally genuine. It is not of the fake. There are a few outliers, people that try to falsify their data for one reason or another. And Susanne has already told us that lots of people who are pretending to be scientists and falsifying data, and the story that she has told us about the vast intertwined network of vested interests that are operating sometimes often in secret, but certainly under our radar for most of us, in spinning stories that are changing how we tell the stories about our world. That it's a very compelling argument, a very compelling narrative, and it's one that we really should be paying more attention to. We need to be listening to journalists and other truth tellers like Susanne that are revealing the world to us as it actually is underneath the stories that we're being told. But as I said, I want to turn to Robert first. So the problem, you said at the end of your conversation, the end of your presentation, that you see the fakery as essentially a structural problem, not so much a problem of discourse. And while, as an English professor, I'm always focused on discourse, I take that very seriously because I think that it reveals the general problem that's been uncovered in all of these talks, which is that there are structural forces and alignments of interest for good and ill that are shaping how we are doing our science, how we are doing our public science in particular, how we reach out to people, and how they what they take away from what we tell them, how we are teaching our young people in the classroom and in the field, and how we are communicating between ourselves. And those structural problems are due to some extent to the vested interests and the conspiracies essentially of interest that Susanne and others like her have revealed, but they're also more fundamental in our culture in certain ways, and I think that's something we should probably talk more about. That there are inertias and refusals and anxieties stimulated, perhaps even legitimately, by the stories that are about the world. So Jasmine raises a series of questions for us about the power of framing. And how we frame a story is really crucial to understanding what its impact is likely to be. And we are often, without our awareness, being inframed by those that are designing the stories that are told to us. So when we are drawn by the allure of influencers on whichever of the social media that we use or in other settings, we are not often entirely aware. What we thought was our sort of affective, our emotional interest in them, our admiration for their accomplishments, or just maybe a kind of sort of, slightly perverse quality of wanting to see where that crazy person's going next. There's a story being told to us, and if others are controlling how that story is told, the very force of the language, the force of the images can compel us to adopt that in framing, can compel us to adopt the way the story has been framed. This is even greater a problem, as we have seen most recently very popularly in the media, if we have artificial intelligence involved that's building frameworks of storytelling based upon sampling and algorithms that are, if we're generous, of suspect accuracy, but if we're not generous, we might wonder why it is that these algorithms are always wrong in exactly the same way, that they always tend to favor, well, I'll just say it, people that look a bit more like me than look like Jasmine, right? I mean, that they structure around race and class and gender identity in ways that replay prejudices that we should have left long behind, and that somehow still infect our thinking in almost the second decade of the 21st century. So we have to pay very close attention to the technologies of storytelling that increasingly drive the way we consume stories in ways that we are not yet up to grappling with. It's happening so fast that those of us who remember when there wasn't an internet understand how profoundly it has changed the way you understand meaning in the world. I'm speaking mostly to the young people. I want to talk about Ken. I mean, Ken's raised a really important point about deep time and how it is very difficult for us to imagine the cycles, the turns, the crises of climate over at least the last 10 or 13,000 years since the last period of glaciation. It's very difficult for us to imagine that because it's outside of our comprehension. I do want to add as an aside, though, it's very important. There's a wonderful anthropologist, Patrick Noon, who works in Australia, and he's just recently published this incredible book in which he has coordinated or aligned, if you will, the geophysical evidence for sea level rise in the Australian continent after the end of the last period of glaciation. He's coordinated that with ancient Aboriginal stories. And it turns out that our sisters and brothers living in Australia, the oldest continuously active human culture going back 50,000 years, they documented those sea level rises. Their stories talk about the waters rising and turning hunting grounds into islands and pushing them back from the water. So we could benefit, and we need always, we need to be paying very close attention to the wisdom of ancient peoples who have been paying attention themselves and talking about this for far longer than Enlightenment European, overeducated white dudes like me. We need to be paying attention to these people because they have a font of wisdom and experience. And they are, of course, they have been for a very long time, and especially since, the invasion of that continent by Europeans, they have learned how to live within conditions of profound resource constraint that may be the future of all of us, and we could learn from them about how to do that and how to still have families and clans and love and passion and joy in a world in which we don't have as much stuff, right? Or our stuff is very fragile. So, but I do appreciate the need to come even closer and to use some of the new technologies. I have had the great pleasure and honor of being at Sena Odi, the dig that Ken has been working on, this location, and to be deeply moved by the remnants of the factory and the workers' villages that were there, that were washed away by this famous hurricane. It's 1896? Yeah, 1896 hurricane, which miraculously didn't kill anybody, but they washed away the whole town and on this island, and to see the remnants of that, and to see, I was especially moved when we visited an abandoned graveyard and saw the sort of the permanence of that as a memorial of the lives and loves of people that whose evidence is otherwise gone. And I think it's extremely interesting to bring these new technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality into those spaces to revivify, to make them alive again, especially to a younger generation that is conversant with that kind of digital media. And Marcel's point here about cultural backlash is very, very important. Part of the reason why we've had, speaking for myself, I think the other panelists would agree, why we've had this remarkable resurgence or upsurgence, I don't know what the right word is here, but a kind of flourishing of denialist discourses is as a cultural backlash to the changing demography of Europe, and speaking for the United States of America, that America is becoming browner. It's becoming more female in terms of how it is in terms of positions of authority and power and contribution to the economy. And there are a lot of people that are made very uncomfortable by these kinds of transformations. The diversity of religions, the diversity of class, the diversity of viewpoints is making people very, very uncomfortable, and they're pushing back. What is tricky is that the cultural backlash, particularly with regard to climate crisis and climate change, is entangled with a bunch of other narratives of resistance and refusal. So it gets bound up with conversations about race and gender and class. And the people who are drawn to these narratives, who are drawn to the narratives of denialism, are not drawn because they're drawn to the pseudosciences that inform it. They're largely drawn to it because it reinforces existing fears and anxieties that they already had. When they hear someone talking about whether or not it's true that the sea levels are rising and what they will do to the lives of hundreds of millions of people before the end of this century, and there are people in this room right now that will live to see the end of this century and have to confront the reality of a greater human migration taking place in the next 80 years than has occurred in the entire existence of our species, let alone our civilization, right? When they hear those stories, they have a hard time buying them, not because they can't imagine those outcomes, but because it's entangled with all these other fears they have about losing their guns, about losing the control over their religious lives, about who their children are going to marry or love or spend their time with. And the power of this narrative that bundles racial identity and nationalist identity and religious identity with climate denialism is it's a very alluring and very powerful intoxicant for people that are finding a way to numb the fears that they have for all those other reasons. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, that I would say that climate change is no longer one of the great crises or problems we face. It's the background of all the others. It's the ecosystem in which racial conflict, gender conflict, nationalist conflict, religious conflict, all those things are flourishing, expanding, and growing worse. That means it multiplies those effects. The injustices and inequalities that we see in our world are magnified by the physical changes, the changes in our physical reality that climate crisis brings to us. And I'll close with just a general observation that's, again, more me than anything else. out of due deference to all of my colleagues here, my wonderful colleagues here. So the stories that we tell are efficacious. They produce effects. They produce action. They can produce an action in sympathy with the story. They can produce an action in kind of contrary to the story. And I would call out to our young friends here that when you hear stories that trouble you or concern you because they seem to be based on, driven by motives that are not generous, that are not compassionate, that are not just, you need to resist those narratives. You need to take action to resist them and to tell your own stories to work against them. You need to determine between storytelling in bad faith and storytelling in good faith. Because there are people telling bad faith stories. There are people who are telling stories because it will help them to consolidate and control more of the world, consolidate their control over the world, and to profit from the suffering of humans and other animals on the planet. And there are people who are telling bad faith stories because they're kind of alienated. They like I said, their concept of climate crisis is bound up with some other fear that they have. Something about, again, whether they have the freedom to possess a gun, or who their daughter is going to marry, or whether there's going to be a place of worship built in their town that doesn't correspond to the traditions that they remember when they were children. So they have a hard time disentangling it. I don't think those are malevolent people. They may take malevolent actions, but in a way they're also telling stories in bad faith because they aren't examining the conditions of their own understanding of the world. But I think, and here I'm going to end on a hope of note, in part because I see so many young people in the class. One of the great joys of teaching in a university is you spend your time with younger people. And I see a generational shift taking place. I do see an awareness among younger people. And I have a kid in high school, so I'm also kind of, plugged into that. And I talk to her and her friends too. You have a sense that they're capable of being more discerning about which stories are told in good faith and which stories are told in bad faith. And that is the recipe for concrete and productive action in the world, is to listen to the stories that are told, pay attention to how they're told, pay attention to under what conditions they're told, pay attention to who's telling them in the sense of how deep is their knowledge, right? Act in accord with the stories that you hear as appropriate, pro or con to the story, against it or for it, and then tell your own stories. Make your own stories. The future is yours to narrate. The future is yours to tell the stories about. And what really matters is, will it be a story of a more just, compassionate world in which more of us are determined to share less? Or will it be a world in which we deny the fires that are burning until it is too late to put them out? The waters that are rising before it is too late to hold them back.
I'd like to thank our panel very, very much. We are going to reconvene this evening at 8. If you're able to come back, we have a commemoration of the 30-year anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall at 8 p.m. But this has been, I think, a wonderful discussion this afternoon. I thank all of the panelists, and
Thank you, Will, for putting this together.
Absolutely.